I'm not going to do presenter mode just because I find this is easier. And I want to go to a quotation that I put in the chat. If we dive deep enough, we'll find that there are very few elements at the base, the root causes, which through cause and effect connections are governing the whole system. This is from a well-known kind of business self-help author, Eli Goldratt, from his book, The Choice. But it gets to this, problem that I've been working through is that as we look at these complex challenges, as we look at our polycrisis, right? Global climate change being front and center in that. We have a number of crises that are intertwined. We have a crisis in our economic systems that don't work for people. We have a crisis in government. We have crisis in education, right? And so I've been on this quest in many ways for 30 years, certainly in the last 10, really intensely over the last 3 to figure out what are some of the root causes, right? Because we have to understand these causes for us to be able to act on those and to build different solutions. The work that we're doing with District of Learning is recognizing that schools can't and shouldn't have to go it alone, right? That they can't be the center of the learning universe. Like Copernicus, who, figured out that, the earth was not the center of the universe. He got us part of the way there, right? With this heliocentric model where the sun realized that the sun is the center of the universe. So schools are not the center of the learning universe. Learning happens, particularly purpose-driven learning, happens across school and community and digital environments. And so how can we recognize that and turn entire communities into a campus for learning? That was the mission of the MacArthur Foundation Cities of Learning Initiative and our work here in Washington, D.C. with what we call District of Learning, which is our iteration here in Washington, D.C. And what we used as a mechanism for this is really important because it gets to this idea of data ownership. In data ownership, the term that Jerome Lanier coined is data dignity, which I like because it takes a much broader term. It's that we have a right to not have our information exploited. We have a right to privacy and security. And these are things that, because of the fundamental imbalance in the way that the internet was created, we haven't been able to claim for a long time. And so we have kind of these parallel problems that are going on. I talked about these root causes, right? We have on the web, we have a system that puts all the power in the hands of platforms. In our communities with learning, we have a system that puts all the power in the hands of schools. And so how do we look at a solution that gets to both and boil this down to some fundamental issues around this term learner agency, how effective we feel about making an impact in our own lives, and then efficacy, which is how we feel about making an impact in our community and society as a whole, right? So how do we get at these kind of problems of agency and efficacy from the point of being able to share our own stories, right? We struggle, and certainly the systems that exist on the internet, they're telling our stories for profit. Schools are telling our stories for their own accountability purposes, right? We might get diplomas that can help us tell it somewhat, but not really. Nobody hands a diploma to somebody and says, hey, look, this is who I am, right? And so what we started with District of Learning was this idea of digital badges. And a badge, you may have seen these displayed places. There's a common open badges standard. Each badge shows what a learner did to earn the badge. The evidence of the learning can be tagged in the badge. It can be linked to standards. And it's just a way for us to make authentic learning count no matter where or when it happens. And in a world where we have all this data in educational systems about young people, this is something that they can own, right? It's not a test score, right? It's not a diploma, which is really, it's not something in Power School or whatever system your school's using. It's something that you can keep and own. And now we worked on this for 5 years and had a lot of successes and a lot more challenges. And what we figured out is that there's things that were missing that we had to build into this. And I'll get to that in a minute. And then along the way, we discovered that there's a lot more exciting things going on with technology. And I love this, quote from the hockey great Wayne Gretzky, right? You can't skate to where the puck is now. You have to skate to where the puck is going. And so part of this is a little bit of kind of future thinking about how do we skate? How do we help others also come with us to where the puck's going on technology? Because during the pandemic, this chasm was widening, right? What we saw is that our inability to cultivate agency and ownership of learning was on full display. Over 1 million students in the U.S. alone just kind of disappeared off the map. And technology, it just kept racing ahead, right? And so we had students stuck in Zoom schools, which is like the worst of tech and the worst of school combined a lot of times. And so this future started racing ahead. On top of it, technology itself is pulling us apart. In many ways, it's being used to pull us apart for profit through hyper-personalization. And so we started looking at technologies like augmented reality and virtual reality, and this idea that augmented reality is a technology that could bring us together, right, in a community, rather than virtual reality, which could pull us apart into different parts of the metaverse. And looking at how can focusing our technology future on learning actually bring us together. There was a comment in the chat earlier, and I'm not looking at the chat now because I am on screen share, but it said about teachers as learners, right? We all teach, we all learn, we all support the learning of others. It is our learning DNA. It literally brings us together as humans, right? We are created as social beings and have evolved this way. The way technology has mutated that has been damaging, and we need to re-embody this in important ways. And we'll talk about how we can do that. But by focusing on these commonalities, on these things that unify us, we can build a different future, not just for learning, but also for technology. And so during the pandemic, we evolved district learning into learning pathmakers. It was to both respond to our education equity crisis and to end this big chasm that was growing. And so 3.5 years ago, we started looking at what was happening with AI. This stuff, for those of us who've been working in technology, the new round of tools, we knew this was coming. We didn't think it'd get here this fast or be this good. And now we have a lot of work. But the fortunate thing is now people can see it. They know what we've been dealing with all along in the background, algorithms and platforms, right? Now we have words to it. Now we have images to it. So how can we look at this future? We're talking about these 4 technologies for elements of digital society. Data is water, Web3 is earth, AI is fire, and XR is air. And this is an analogy I'm using with our middle school students. We're going to be building some stuff around this I'll get back to in the presentation. But how do we look at these and chart a different pathway? We're really, really good at saying, okay, things should be different than they are now. We're really good at protesting about it, right? We think youth voice is being heard, right? When what we should be focusing on is being understood and understanding each other. because that's the basis for governance, and governance is the basis for change. Okay. So instead of just thinking about visions of the future, it's how do we think about pathways? That's hence the name Learning Pathmakers. What do we do first? Right? In the face of all this overwhelm with global climate change and everything else, where do we start? Okay. That's what we've been charting a pathway to do, is figuring out where we start. And then how can this bring us together to chart this different pathway into the future? This is getting back to what I talked about, like this fundamental imbalance of the web, right? And these root causes, many of them are invisible. One of the root causes of what we're experiencing now, with a crisis of capitalism, with a crisis of democracy, and a crisis of environmental catastrophe, goes back to the way the web was created. I know that sounds really kind of overly simplistic, but Web 2 in the late 90s, some of us were around then and working on this. We had what we call the dot-com boom. And what enabled the dot-com boom was a change in the way that the web was created, the World Wide Web, which sits on top of the internet. The internet is the actual technical infrastructure. The web is the platforms and systems that exist on top of this. And so what it did is it created these technical specifications for what they call state. And it's what allowed the systems to know that you and a particular website were interacting with each other. This was the advent of usernames and passwords and cookies, right? Which, people said, oh, now we can do more than just see how many people have been looking at our website. Now we can use it to sell things to people, right? And those usernames and passwords don't belong to us, actually. They're on loan, right? If you think about Web 2 is a library, right? And what we need to move to is a diary. So this promise, what we've seen when you hear people talk about Web 3, and there's bits and pieces of this that have bubbled up because people are just, their first thing is like, how can we make money off this? And a lot of people, how do we scam people on it, right? Cryptocurrency. But these features of Web 3, as they're calling it, are in fact revolutionary. They will allow us to exist on the internet without being tied to a particular platform, what we call self-sovereign identity. It'll allow us to own our data independently of any platform or system, right? And so what we have right now is a web that was supposed to be democratic, but in fact, it's an oligarchy. It's built on authoritarian models. That you have these empires, which we have to go back to medieval times to see the kind of power that's been concentrated in the authority structures that exist. Emperor Constantine would blush at the power of Jeff Bezos. And it goes back to the fact that the platforms have all the power. And so instead of having customer to customer in business terms, right, C to C, what we end up is C to B to C, where B controls the transaction and skims profits, and we don't have any power or rights, right? Uber, Amazon, Etsy, PayPal, all this stuff, right? That's the empires of Web 2. We can move to Web 3, and what Web 3 is really about, because we've been looking at decentralization, it's not enough to build decentralization. We've been trying to do that in a lot of different ways in education, by like hacking your own education pathways. We've been trying to do that with the web in many ways, and with this first wave of Web 3. And anarchy is decentralized. Decentralization runs right back to authoritarianism as people concentrate powers. The hedge against this is we have to create governance. We have to create democracy. And so when I use this as an analogy with the AI Club, I was like, okay, your school right now in this classroom, who has all the power? They're like, you do. I'm like, right. Number one, I'm glad you recognize that, because it's middle schoolers that comes in handy a lot of times. But that's not the way that I want the class to run. It's certainly not the way that we want education to run. So how do we think about something differently, right? And so we talked about the kinds of things that we need to do to create a different level of governance. And recognizing that governance starts with some basic rights, right? And so this is where I may get a bit far afield, but just kind of bear with me. I'd like to share a little bit about political theory and political philosophy. And so let's go back to John Locke. John Locke said, we have these natural rights, okay? John Locke said these rights were life, liberty, and property. Now, he had a very narrow and Western conception of what these are, right? They were very individualistic. He also said that he should own the property that his slave has collected, right? That's the kind where we were on this at this level. But this is what was embedded in the U.S. Constitution is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? We have certain unalienable rights that are given to us by the Creator. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These fundamental natural rights have been denied us by Web 2. Web 3 will allow us to change that. And so how do we rethink about what it means to claim our rights as citizens? And so instead of life, liberty, and property, and I could talk a lot more about this, I won't delve too into this, maybe for another follow-up conversation. But instead of life, liberty, property, if you think about integrity and opportunity and regeneration. And then when we are able to claim citizenship, which nobody can claim your citizenship for you, right? They can't create some digital tool that'll do this. We can't build democracy with voting machines. It's that people have to learn about this to be able to claim these. We have to co-create democracy with people, not for them. That once we are able to claim these new rights, this new self-empowerment, as you will, then we can actually build a new generation of platforms and systems in our technology world, but also in our real world that are embedded with the kinds of representation and accountability and justice that have gotten far away from us. Right? We've had this vision of government. We'll just take American government as an example. These three institutions of, legislative, executive, and judicial. They're not working. They've failed us. And they've failed us with the climate crisis. Every government around the world has failed us with the climate crisis, right? So it's not that we don't know what the problem is. It's that we haven't been able to organize ourselves in a way that we can solve it. Okay. And that's where it's a little bit difficult for me to explain. ChatGPT helps me with this sometimes. But that's where we have to look back at like these fundamental rights and starting with claiming our data, this issue of data dignity. As we look at these complex problems, data dignity is at the root of this. And so we've been working with a set of schools here in DC to pilot this work, a team that includes one of the finalists for National Teacher of the Year, because, I can talk theory all the time, but we have to make it very tangible for people. And what we're leading with is we had this Learning Pathmakers expedition that we did over the last 3 years, which looked at these set of steps that we needed to fill in some of the gaps on the human side that were impeding our progress for disruptive learning. And then looking at this whole new range of technology tools that we have available at our disposal to create a learning ecosystem that also then becomes the way that people can learn about these technologies. And what we've narrowed in on is this issue of owning your learning story, right? We have this gap that exists right now between the way that we experience learning and the way that we're expected to tell our story. This slide here just looks at kind of one model on each side. On the left-hand side here is David Kolb's experiential learning cycle. My shorthand for that is do it, did what, so what, now what, right? It's just the way that learning happens. Purpose-driven learning happens. And then on the other side, we see this STAR framework, which like Amazon and other companies use for interviewing, which is, okay, tell me about a situation that you faced. What was the task at hand? What did you do? What was the result? Situation, task, action, result. We were trying to use badges with District of Learning to bridge this gap, but what we realized is we needed something even more fundamental, and that's where we've developed this framework for what we call DOTES. DOTES, short for anecdotes. It combines the earliest way that we tell our stories for learning, which is show and tell. Then we science it up a little bit with observe and explore, right? And this is, we're working with the middle schoolers now to work through and have them craft their DOTES, because, learning happens everywhere and we need a framework to be able to tell it. And if this framework is in a particular format, then that becomes a story that we can hold on to in a very important way. It's one that we're using as a basis to build basically a public utility, an operating system for data dignity and data governance. And so imagine these different pieces: do, observe, tell, explore. Do is just like a header. Observe is like just that, like what went well. It's a text field. Tell is another text field. So is explore. And then show is a multimedia object, right? It could be a picture. It could be a video. It could be the code that you wrote. It could be the robot that you created. Now, is this, some authoritative credential? No. But when you start to assemble these stories with AI, now we can use it to mix and remix our stories to retell them in all sorts of amazing ways. And so if we put these DOTES as entries in a learning ledger into data backpacks, then this becomes something that is a new future for building learning ecosystems, a new basis for governance, a new basis for generative AI, what we call all these foundation models who've gotten their data from unpermissioned sources all over the web, and a new platform for Web3. The next few slides are just some framing that we'll do with the Middle School AI Club, which may spur some ideas or conversation. There are also things that we've been developing, which is thinking about our DOTES in 3 categories as character, excellence, and service. If you think about these as these DOTES as like fruit on your tree, right? And then if we think about those trees as in fact identries, these being virtual storyboards for learning in Web3 and the metaverse, like you can use these DOTES, and this is what we're doing with the Middle School AI Club, is we're actually helping them learn about this by building their own chatbots that tell their learning stories, like learning by doing, actually to claim data dignity. And then these identries, become your representation. Then your avatar is your fashion statement, but your identity tells your story. And, ideally, it would be great if I could have started one of these when I was 13, like they are, right? But the 2 best times to plant a tree are, 20 years ago or now. And so for young people today to be able to securely connect their learning stories, and then also have a platform, as you see in this slide here, that when we build this around learning stories, then we can take all this data that you have about you and these other sources, and we can migrate it over to that same platform. So that instead of all this information being in, a mishmash of Power School and whatnot, and who knows what they're doing with it, that you can control this, because that becomes the basis for how we control AI. Okay. And this is just a little bit of a conceptual leap. AI works because it's been trained on data. Owning our learning stories is, owning our data is how we tell our story for success in school and work and life. Owning our learning data is how we learn about data ownership. Let me just say that again. Owning our data is how we tell our story for school and work and life. Owning our learning data is how we learn about data ownership. So this is the place for experiential learning to claim the power of data dignity, right? And then once we do that, then we're working with a team of collaborators across the globe in education and technology and civic society to build these operating systems, this platform for DOTs. We're working with the middle schoolers because they need to lead the way. And this is a group of low income, mostly Black and brown students in Washington, D.C., who keep me on my toes every day. But we also know that like where this has to go is not in curriculum, is not in something that requires an expensive computer lab in a school, or even more than a handheld device. What it's got to go to is a XR community-wide game to help young people take charge of technology and learning at the same time. And that's where we are getting into this game we're developing called Digents. And we're still in early stage, but this goes back to this idea of these elements being earth, air, fire, water, working with the students on the game design, because ultimately what we need to build is to bring people together through learning to create a world that belongs to all of us. And by starting with this core foundation of data dignity, it gets at things that people need right now. We can't just solve for the future. We have to solve for now in a way that also solves for the future. So data dignity helps us build AI that we can control. As we can control our AI, then this gives us an opportunity where instead of just relying on what these like ChatGPT, it's called large language models. So what we can get is like ecosystem specific and community-based community language models, where we have AI that brings together people in a particular community with what they know, augmented by technology to solve specific problems, right? So if we think about this as enabling ecosystems.